Welcome to the Minnesota Revival History Channel. I'm Dale Gilmore. On Sunday, April 27th, 1975, the St. Paul Pioneer Press ran a news article that was not widely disseminated. The article was about an event 98 years previous in 1877. That spring, locusts threatened two-thirds of Minnesota. With nothing to fight this invasion, as a last resort, many Minnesotans turned to prayer. The article said, and I quote, "The spring of 1877 has been looked to with great foreboding. As the state legislature convened during January that year, in the old Capitol, near what is now 10th and Exchange Streets, the state entomologist made a report that sent fear through every legislator's heart. It showed that while locust invasions had been scattered through the state during 1873, 1874, and 1875, tests in the autumn of the preceding year revealed they covered the entire southern and western portions of Minnesota. The area seeded with their eggs is more than two-thirds of the state," the report said. It covered 50,000 of the state's 80,000 square miles. The legislators were rightly worried. Those farmers and counties which had previously suffered from locust or grasshopper infestations, were reduced to pauperism. Poverty stalked not only the lands of the new pioneer farmers, but seeped into the towns and cities as well. Business was bad, manufacturers couldn't sell their goods. It may well have been the worst economic crisis in Minnesota history. Unquote. In 1873, the Rocky Mountain grasshoppers, who were starving in the Rockies, came and virtually destroyed the crops in the southwestern counties of Minnesota. And in 1874, the grasshoppers were at it again, but this time they did not have to fly in from the Rocky Mountains. They hatched out of the eggs that females deposited along the countryside the previous fall. Concern grew as people realized that each female grasshopper had probably dropped 20 pods across one immigrant's newly tilled field. Each pod might contain 150 new grasshoppers. And with millions of female grasshoppers leaving pods across the state the previous year, and with no insecticides or pesticides to use, the problem seemed enormous. The grasshoppers came in swarms. As they ate, they sounded, according to one person, like thousands of scissors cutting and snipping. They ruined everything in the garden except the peas. They didn't like peas. Mrs. Jane Sutherland, a new immigrant to Minnesota, paints a picture of an earlier plague. "The crops were looking wonderful," she said. "Wheat fields so green and corn way up. The new plowed fields yielded marvelously. I went out to the garden about 10 o'clock to get the vegetables for dinner and picked peas, string beans, onions, and lettuce that were simply luscious. The tomatoes were setting, and everything was as fine as could be. I felt so proud of it. The men came home to dinner, and the talk was all in praise of this new state of Minnesota and the USA, and the crops. While we were talking, it gradually darkened. The men hastily went out to see if anything should be brought in before the storm. But it wasn't a storm, but a locust plague. What a sight when we opened the door, she said. The sky darkened by myriads of grasshoppers. No green thing could be seen. One terrified lady ran outside in a dress with green stripes. The locusts were landing on her, eating through all the green of the stripes in that dress. And everything in that lovely garden of hers was gone. Now the farmers did everything in their power to stop the grasshoppers. They made hopper dozers, which were large sheets of tar-covered metal nailed to runners. Horses dragged them over the fields to trap the insects in the tar. Then they would take the dozers home, burn off the grasshoppers, and retar the dozer for another run. Other farmers used large burlap bags. One farmer collected 18 bushels of grasshoppers, or roughly 100,000 per bushel, from a 10-acre field. Grasshopper carcasses would remain, and they would foul wells, pollute creeks and rivers, and even impacted trains trying to move up a low-grade track. The tracks were greasy with crushed grasshopper bodies. As spring advanced, people began to express their heightened concerns. From small talk around coal stoves and general stores to knitting bees in homes to the church pulpits across Minnesota, a low murmur became a loud cry. We've tried everything else. Let us ask the governor to proclaim a day of prayer for deliverance from the plague. Unless God comes to our relief, we are ruined. Moved by the appeals, Governor John Pillsbury set aside April 26, 1877, a Thursday, as a day of fasting and prayer. Of course, that proclamation set off controversies. A group formed in Minneapolis, calling itself the Liberal League, published a document April 15th of that year, stating, quote, "We hold that this belief in the power of prayer is palpably untrue, its influence pernicious, and this day is a marked discredit to the intelligence of Minnesota," unquote. However, a small congregation of Catholics met in Cold Spring, Minnesota, at the Jacobs Prairie Church, and pledged to God that if he banished the locusts from their midst, they would erect a chapel to the honor of the Mother of God and give thanks there. Meanwhile, the rest of the nation watched. Newspapers from Chicago to Boston and south to Richmond and Atlanta sent reporters to cover the story. Editorialists in those papers were pro and con, cynical, grave, and often tongue-in-cheek. Letters to the editor of the Pioneer Press and Minneapolis newspapers arrived in bulging mail sacks with a wide spectrum of opinion, hope, fear, faith, and ridicule. Then April 26th arrived. A hush fell over the state. Streets were empty. Stores were closed. Theaters and bars were dark. Only the churches were filled as never before. It was a beautiful, warm April day, and when the sun had set, many said, "We have left it with the Lord. We can do no more." Then they went to their homes and waited to see what would happen. Here is the account from the Pioneer Press about the next 2 days. And I quote, Shortly after midnight on the morning of April 27th, the sky clouded over. Cold rain began to fall. The wind shifted from south to north, and the rain changed to heavy snow. All that day of April 27th, with a few respites, the storm raged, with the rain and snow alternating and then frost coating the lands. Into the morning of April 28th, the storm still vented its fury, and then, when it subsided, the farmers hurried into the fields. With few exceptions, a vast majority of the grasshopper eggs have been frozen or destroyed just as they were hatching. One Pioneer Press editorial writer wrote, "Baby locusts died by the millions from severe colds in the noses," writing in a joyous burst of good cheer and humor. On Sunday, April 29th, another snow stung the same portion of the state and had swept across Nebraska, Iowa, and even up as far as Manitoba. Well, that year as spring arrived, there were other strange manifestations as spring turned into summer. Those eggs which did hatch spewed forth grasshoppers which mysteriously rose and flew away. Not one egg was deposited in Minnesota that summer that was known. The harvest that year was the most bountiful known in the state so far in its history. Never had the fields yielded so many bushels of wheat and corn and small grains." Unquote. Well, the believers in Cold Spring, Minnesota, true to their promise, built a grasshopper chapel near Cold Spring. Interestingly, that chapel was destroyed by a tornado in 1894. The chapel remained in ruins until 1952, when the old chapel was torn down and the chapel was rebuilt with granite facing on the outside and an interior of highly polished pink, red, and gray granite. The chapel still stands in Cold Spring, and over a portal on the building is a carving of the Blessed Virgin rising to heaven with two grasshoppers kneeling in submission. The 1975 news story concludes, and I quote, "By the way, there has never been a serious grasshopper infestation in all the years that have followed April 26, 1877. Unquote. Well, that's all for this time. Thank you for watching the Minnesota Revival History Channel. I'd encourage you to click the like button if you like this video. I'd also encourage you to subscribe to this channel, and you will be the first to know of new videos released. There is no obligation. Again, my name is Dale Gilmore, and I encourage you to trust Jesus Christ for the trials you are experiencing in your life. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So until next time.